Hello, everyone. My name is Jeannie Myung. I wanted to welcome you to today's PACE webinar on special education in California. I am the Director of Policy Research at PACE, and I was the Project Director of the Policy Research Panel on Special Education, which you will hear about today. So glad you have joined this webinar. It's the first in a three-part webinar series to hear from an outstanding group of researchers on special education practices and systems in California. Hopefully you've had the opportunity to read through a few of the 13 research products on special education that PACE released a couple weeks ago. Today we will hear directly from some of the authors of those briefs on their research. Today we will focus on what the research says on how children are identified for and receive special education services in our state and their transitions into and out of special education. What we know is that a coherent continuum of care that identifies student needs and guides students to the support they need when they need it is what we want for our students with disabilities. But too often, what we get instead is missed or late identification of needs, and losing kids and families between the confusing and burdensome cracks in the process. Furthermore, when we think about the goal of IDEA, which is to prepare students with disabilities for further education, employment, and independent living, there's much more that schools can do to better prepare students for that transition out of special education services and schooling. So I am delighted to introduce you to today's panelists who will speak to these issues. We have with us today Nancy Hunt, who is Professor Emerita at Cal State Los Angeles and Discipline Director for Special Education in the California LEND training program, who will discuss issues in early identification of delays and disabilities for young children. Connie Cassery, Professor of Human Development and Psychology at UCLA, who will present on her work on the transition to preschool for young children with disabilities. This is work she conducted with Amanda Demachke and Maria Pisano at UCLA. Carolyn Benno, Assistant Superintendent at the Yolo County Office of Education, will present on her work on student transitions into, between, and out of identification categories in K-12, based on her research on the core districts with Kevin G. and Joe Whitty. We have Lauren Lindstrom, Professor and Dean of the UC Davis School of Education, who will talk to us about evidence-based practices for post-school transitions for students with disabilities with her co-author, again, Carolyn Benno. And we have Fred McFarland, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Administration, Rehabilitation, and Post-Secondary Education at San Diego State University, and his co-author, Mary Guillermo, Project Coordinator at the Interwork Institute at San Diego State. And they will present specifically on work-based learning opportunities to prepare students with disabilities for independent living post-school. Just a few logistics. Given the broad swath of content we are covering and our limited time together, we are anticipating that we will not be able to address all the questions that may come up for you over the course of the webinar and the few minutes for Q&A we'll have in the end. However, our panelists can address some of your questions through the Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of your webinar screen. If you kind of drag down, you'll see a Q&A option, so feel free to type your questions directly into that Q&A box, and you may get a response from some of our panelists. And for questions that don't get addressed, our panelists have agreed to respond to some of those questions in writing after the webinar, and we can post some of their responses to the PACE website. So do type questions you have for them into that Q&A box, and we'll try to be as responsive as possible. And I'll also note that the slides and recording of this webinar will be posted to the PACE website as well. So with that, I'm pleased to transition over to Nancy Hunt, who will discuss how our youngest Californians are screened and identified for special needs. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I guess, Jeannie, I'm moving this slide. Here we go. Okay. We're going to start by talking about the first transition in the life of a child with potentially special needs or disabilities, and that's the transition from no services to services that early intervention it consists of. Most of you know the way our system is supposed to work because it's dictated by both federal and state law. And I won't go through all of this, but we know that under Part C of IDEA, early intervention services are supposed to be provided for children who states identify as needing them. And these services are also very much focused on the role of their family in helping the child develop well. In California, our early intervention program is called Early Start, and our lead agency is the Department of Developmental Services in collaboration with the Department of Education. And I'll just quickly go over how Early Starts planned out how their system works. And I think it's most kind of interesting if you think about a baby or a toddler you know, and you go and visit that baby and you think, gee, that baby's not making eye contact with me. That baby's very quiet. That baby's not talking. I'm concerned about that child's development. So what should happen next? Ideally, what happens next is during a well baby visit to the pediatrician, a screening takes place. And if the child's screening is significantly below the norm, the child should be referred by a professional, the pediatrician, to regional center. And you probably know that there are, I think, 23 regional centers across California, each one independent, although following the same rules and regulations. Regional center's responsibility then is to evaluate the child and see if he or she makes the criterion for eligibility, plan for services, identify family concerns, and write up the document called the IFSP, the Individualized Family Service Plan, which lists outcomes for both the child and the family, the family with the intent that they will need some services to meet the needs of the child. And again, to kind of personalize this, I think, and make it more interesting, part of the reason we feel a great urgency in this area of early intervention is that there's well-documented evidence that the earlier intervention starts for a young child, the better the outcomes. And our assumptions are that high quality, consistent early intervention can reduce developmental delays and lessen the adverse developmental effects of risk factors and disabilities. So you know that early intervention doesn't cure disability or solve all the problems, but it gets the child and the family into services that are designed for individual needs. And it's more effective the earlier it's begun. And effective early screening and assessment can result in earlier provision of intervention. And this is what we would all want for ourselves, our own children, our grandchildren, and the children that we care about. And the question is, how do we provide that same urgency for families who aren't as sure about the system as professionals are? So we know that there's a large body of research that has demonstrated that, again, high quality early intervention for infants and toddlers with delay and disability has the potential to decrease special education funding over the lifetime of the child, decrease grade repetition, and so forth and so on. I don't think I have to read all of this to you, but the one that I think for those of you who are associated with school districts and the state, the whole idea of lowering costs attached to early intervention is very important. And I think one of the things that many of us in the field care about very much now is the link between receipt of special ed services and involvement in the juvenile justice system, which can start as early as preschool with expulsions from preschool. So again, it's very well documented that early intervention can provide these benefits. The problem is not all eligible children are receiving these services. And this is not just a California problem, it's a national problem. Part of it is natural. Unless a disability is quite significant, it's not identified in the delivery room. It's identified over time, often during the first year of life. But one influential study done by Rosenberg and colleagues looked at a national database and found that although about 13% of the children who had developmental delays would be eligible for Part C services, only 10% of the children with delays were receiving those services. So 10% of that 13% were receiving services. We need to improve that. And the most recent data from the United States Department of Education, and this is also in the most recent 41st annual report to Congress, about 3.1% of the total population of infants and toddlers receives early intervention services. And in California, we have a somewhat lower percentage of 2.9. So a lot of young children are not receiving these services that might help them. Where are we missing them? What's going wrong here? I think it's helpful to think of the whole process of moving from concern to services as a kind of a funnel. You start off with a larger number and end up with a small one. And so this is not California data that you see on the screen here. It's from a study done in Pennsylvania, I believe. And they looked at over 1,000 young children screened by pediatricians. Of those children, about 200 failed the screening. And from that number, about 100 were referred to early intervention. So there's our first example of children falling between the cracks, between screening and referral. Now, you know that not every child gets screened, so this is not the only problem we have here. Screening can be much wider based than it is. But if 100 are referred, then only 63 of their children got to intake, got to the point where they have that interview and multidisciplinary evaluation. Finally, of that number, 31 were eligible for services and 24 received services. So at every step along the way, there's fallout of children and families from services. And part of what we have to do is really figure out why the fallout is happening and do our best to address it. You may be familiar with a couple of recent Legislative Analyst Office reports on early intervention. One was fairly recent, just before the governor submitted his last year's budget. And the LAO professionals talked to a lot of people and kind of informally found these reasons up here for why children don't receive early intervention services. First of all, there are children in California who don't receive regular physician checkups, and there's concern that some of these may be the children who need them the most. And pediatricians don't consistently screen children for developmental challenges. It's time consuming. It may not be seen as a priority. We really don't have much data about which physicians screen and which do not, but my guess would be that more recently trained physicians probably do more screening because it's now an important part of medical education. And when physicians do screen, they don't always refer eligible children. And if they refer, sometimes parents don't follow through. One study showed that when someone in the pediatrician's office helped the family make the next step to referral, whether it's filling out forms or making a phone call, there was a much higher level, but on their own, parents don't always follow through. And sometimes those who do follow through become discouraged before their children receive services. Remember, these are very young babies. Families are just beginning to understand what it means that their child's not meeting developmental milestones. And so there's just lots of opportunity for things to go wrong. So what can we do to improve this situation? One thing that I think you'll hear throughout all of our presentations today is our children in our state would benefit from a unified data collection system that really started at birth and goes throughout the lifetime. So we need to expand and improve our system of data collection and connect the systems so that we can make decisions about where to. Sorry, my cat's going to be popping in here. Get down, Olivia. Interagency agreements must be more explicit and have better coordination and follow through. Families need supports in following through on referrals. This last one, if I had had a chance to take this last bullet off, I would have, because I recently went out to visit a regional center and talked to their early start group and realized what a committed and hardworking group of professionals they are. They have incentives for services for children, and so they're really doing as good a job as they can, many of them right now. Okay, Jeannie, I need to move my slide and it's not happening. Oh, here we go. A couple of useful models. Which states do this well? Well, Massachusetts does it well, in part because their lead agency for early intervention is public health. And so they have done an excellent job of providing a data system which does connect medical and educational and developmental services in the state. So they have served 9.4% of their birth to 3 population in the last year. We have figures in 2016. And that's the Pell data system, if you want to look it up. And then I need to go forward. Okay. Another program that many of you may be familiar with because it's being implemented in some parts of California is Help Me Grow. It's a national program that has as its goals some of the same things that I've been talking about earlier, and more consistent screening, help with referrals to services, coordination among agencies, and so forth. It's being implemented by First 5 California and First 5 LA, and it's potentially a system that could link together all our kind of cumbersome systems in California, if we could all decide to use it. Before I close, because I often report on the discouraging aspects of this task of identifying children and getting them into services, I want to make clear that there are a lot of people in California doing good work in this area, among them the State Screening Task Force and First 5 LA and Early Start and CTAN. CTAN is the arm of Early Start that provides professional development. So there's a lot of good work going on, but we need better coordination and focus and a data system. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Nancy. We'll transition it over now to Connie to talk to us about the transition of students with disabilities into LEA preschool. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, good afternoon. So I'm going to talk about the transition between the early services that Nancy talked about and preschool services for children with disabilities. So we'll talk about what is the transition, how is California doing, and then some recommendations. So first, what is Part C? Well, we just heard about Part C from Nancy. These are federally mandated services through IDEA. They're birthed at 3 years of age, and they're administered through the Department of Developmental Services. So here, children can be identified with a developmental delay, a disability, or an established risk condition. In California in 2016, that was only 2.9% of infants. And more than 80% of these children are served in a home context. So they're served by occupational therapists, by speech therapists, or by educators or others, but 80% in the home. What happens in Part B is that when children turn 3 at 36 months, they are now eligible for Part B services. These are what we're concerned about here are the 3 to 5-year-old services in Part B. These services are administered through the Department of Education, and here the eligibility is different. So children have to be identified with one of the 14 categories of the Department of Education. In California in 2016, that was 5.4% of preschoolers. And in contrast to Part C services, 80% of these children are served in center-based care, usually a school setting, and usually a special education school setting, in part because we don't have universal preschool, so there are very few neurotypical preschools that children can enter into. So we're concerned about how children transition from one service to the next. And we are particularly concerned because we want to make sure that all children who need services in California are indeed being identified, referred, and served. So how's California doing in this transition from Part C services to Part B? So the main takeaways are that California falls below national averages in both identifying and serving infants, toddlers, and preschoolers with developmental disabilities. We are under-identifying children in every racial ethnic category. And because of this, California is currently under federal watch for not meeting compliance guidelines. We have several barriers to improvement, which I'll talk about. One is that we have these different sectors or these different systems and different eligibility criteria. Another is that we have differences in family and staff expectations and training. And then we don't have a centralized ongoing monitoring and evaluation system. So if we just look at this table, this is from 2016, we have about 2.9% of children in California who are receiving Part C services, but this is below the national average percentage of 3.1. Another issue is that in terms of the children transitioning from C to B at age 3, is that 45% of our children are transitioning out of Part C services compared to about 16% nationally. And just 1.8% are clearly eligible for Part B services. So this seems like success, like we're doing really well in that children are transitioning out of these infancy services and not needing additional services. But the issue is that about a pretty good chunk, about 38% of children are leaving Part C services, the infant services, with undetermined eligibility. And this is much higher than what we see in the federal percentages. When we think about who's transitioning in a timely fashion to those Part B services, so right when a child turns 36 months, they should be in Part B services. But we're at about 79% compared to about 96% nationally. So we're not doing very well. And because of this, we're under federal watch for not meeting these compliance standards. So what is undetermined eligibility? So about a third of children are in this category. And this has to do with the system's eligibility. So you can be developmentally delayed in Part C, but when you get to Part B, you have to fit into one of those 14 categories. And this is a problem in that Part C services are not identifying those eligibility categories so that there's a smooth transition into Part B. And then, of course, Part B doesn't take just general developmental delay. So this can cause a delay in the transition, as children will probably need assessment and referral to gain access to those Part B services. Another issue that's becoming increasingly clear is that we've had an increase in children being diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder, and autism is often diagnosed just before age 3. And so a lot of times children are getting private agency services because of they can get services through their insurance. And this is often at greater hours than is being offered in their Part B services or their Part C services, either one. And so families, when they make this transition at age 3 into Part B, they may not want to access Part B services because a lot of times they're at fewer hours than what they're currently receiving. So families will often request the system, the Part B system, to continue those high intensity services. And so that's costly for Part B services, but it also can mean that families are not transitioning into Part B and using private services. For staff and families, we have a lack of trained educators to work with children with disabilities. So in 2016, about 3.4 trained special educators per 100 children served under the Part B services. So that's a problem. We also have difficulty having enough educators that are culturally and linguistically diverse to match our families. Families also feel this sort of mismatched focus between the Part B services or the Part C and Part B. So in Part C services, families get an individualized family service plan where the goals are really around the family. Versus when the child goes into the school system, it's around the children's needs. So they get an individualized education plan. So the focus here is really different. Parents can feel like they're an insider with Part C services, with a family and IFSP, but then they feel sometimes that they have to give way to a system or give their child up to the system, and they're just not as involved in the school system. So that can be a problem. Of course. Sorry, guys. And of course it's spam because that's all we get these days. Now I've lost my slides in this process. Sorry. I have no idea. Do you guys see the slides still?
We see it, Connie.
Okay, because I don't. Okay, so I don't know how I'm changing the slides because they're not coming up now. Let me try to rejoin. Okay, here we go. All right. So another issue is that we have we don't actually know what we don't know because we don't have really good progress monitoring and evaluation. So it's hard to know what these different expectations are. So we don't have a standardized measure. We know that in California, kids are functioning within age expectations in Part C for about 67% of the kids, but we're substantially, not seeing an increase in this rate of growth in California. But it's hard to know what this means because we don't have meaningful outcome measures or standard outcome measures. Let's see. Okay. So recommendations. So I think that there are several things that California can do. One is that, and Nancy had talked a little bit about this, is that we need a centralized screening and child tracking system. So if children come into the Part C services with an ID number that then stays consistent as we track them across services, whether they leave Part C and don't come into Part B, but maybe resurface later in a different system, but also for children who are going from Part C to Part B. So having one centralized ID will help us track children. We also need to have a little bit better interagency coordination, so one system of administration. And there are states that have done this. Another idea that states have done to kind of systematize the system is to only have access into Part B services a couple times during a year. So, for example, in October or February, because currently children can come in at any time whenever they turn 3. And so it can be very chaotic for the system just to keep up with that. Another issue is to have an improved workforce. So we need better training and more special educators that are trained to work with young children with disabilities. We also need a more linguistically diverse and culturally sensitive or a cultural group of teachers that can match the families that we are trying to serve. We also need to better prepare families for that transition so they understand what the expectations are when they go into the Part B services into the school system. So starting that transition very early and making sure that all of our materials and the people presenting the material to the families are matching the families' language and cultural needs. And then finally, we need to have a data monitoring system for tracking progress. Currently, we have very little information about how well our children are doing who have disabilities as they transition into and through these different systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Connie. With that, we'll transition over to Carolyn Benno, who will talk to us about entrances and exits in K-12 special education based on analysis of the core districts.
Okay, so for this project, what we were interested in learning more about is how students move into and out of special education, and also how they change between primary disability categories over time. And in order to do this, we analyzed annual data that was collected between 2014-15 school year and the 2017-18 school year on students in the K-12 school system from the core school districts. So that's Fresno, Garden Grove, Long Beach, LA, Oakland, Sacramento, San Francisco, and Santa Ana. So from our analysis, we first looked at how students are entering special education in grades K through 12 in those school districts. So what we did is we took a sample of students that did not have an IEP in one given school year, and then we reviewed those same students in the next school year to see if they had entered special education. And what we found were that the highest entrance rates into special education occurred during the early elementary school years, and the lowest entrance rates into special education occurred in 8th grade. We also noted that there was a slight increase in the number of students entering special education when there was a change in kind of our traditional school settings. So meaning as students had transitioned into middle school, transitioned into high school, or were being set to transition into post-secondary opportunities. So after that, we evaluated how students were exiting special education. So oppositely, this time we took a sample of students that had an IEP in one given grade level, and then looked at whether or not they still had an IEP in the next grade level. And what we found were that the highest exit rates for students with disabilities on an IEP occurred in high school, and the lowest exit rates were observed in the middle school years. The last part of our analysis looked at how students were moving between special education disability categories. So what we tried to do was use a 3-year window of the data, given that eligibility for special education is determined every 3 years. And what we did is after looking at all 13 different categories for special education eligibility, we noted that students who qualify under the category of emotional disturbance and a specific speech and language impairment, they seem to demonstrate the most movement in between categories. So we chose to focus on those two disability categories, and we also looked at students who had a Section 504 plan and how they transitioned into special education from that plan. So first, in looking at the transitions of students who qualified with a primary disability category of a speech and language impairment, what we found was that the percentage of them exiting special education in any given year didn't vary greatly from between grade levels. We saw some increase in terms of the number of students graduating, or not graduating, who are transitioning out of special ed, exiting in the middle school and early high school years. But we found that students that had a speech and language impairment were most likely, if they were going to transition into a different special education eligibility category, to transition into a specific learning disability. Next, we looked at students who initially had a primary disability category of emotional disturbance. And we found that there was quite a bit of movement 3 years later in students with that eligibility category. We found that most students were most likely to be reclassified either under other health impairment or a specific learning disability from the emotional disturbance category. Excuse me. And then finally, we looked at the transitions of students who had a Section 504 plan. So a Section 504 plan is not special education, but it is a special type of plan that is support for students with disabilities as well. And what we found was that students that had one of these Section 504 plans were most likely to enter special education under the other health impairment or a specific learning disability categories. One other thing that we noted was that students on a 504 plan were most likely to exit their 504 plan in the middle school years. And those students weren't necessarily being transitioned onto an IEP, a special education plan. So kind of one of our overall takeaways from this project and our review of the data was just this knowledge that we all have, that it's critical that we ensure that students have this kind of continuity and stability of their educational experiences. And when a student is exiting, whether it be a 504 plan or their IEP, it's just critical that we're really thoughtful about the types of supports they may need as they make that successful transition.
Thank you, Carolyn. So with that, we'll transition over to Lauren, who will talk to us about post-school transitions for students with disabilities.
Thanks, Jeannie. Just if I can get the slides going here. All right, my name's Lauren Lindstrom. I'm a professor and also dean of the School of Education at UC Davis. And unlike my earlier colleagues, I'm going to talk more about the transition at the end of special education in terms of moving from high school into adulthood. That is the area that I've been studying really since about the early 1990s. I've been either developing programs for high school age students or tracking longitudinal outcomes and really trying to understand what predicts different kinds of outcomes over time. After we, invest in both early education and the typically 12 years often of special education, what happens next? So why does this matter? It matters for a couple reasons. First of all, it's part of special education policy. Most of you know that back in 1990, we had the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act passed. And for the first time, that legislation talked about the purpose of special education being thinking about preparation for adulthood. So in addition to teaching all these core academic skills and other skills, social skills, we need to think about what happens next. How do we prepare students? So beginning at age 16, every student with a disability needs to have a transition plan, some transition services in their individual IEP. Some school districts start as early as 14, and that's actually best practice, but at 16, it's mandated. So that's been going on since 1990. So almost 30 years we've had transition services. However, what we know is that our students with disabilities still lag behind their non-disabled peers. Kids with disabilities, and these are federal data, less likely to graduate from high school. We see differential outcomes in post-secondary education. So kids with disabilities are more likely to go to a community college or vocational program, less likely to go to a university. And oftentimes that ends up in very low wage, part-time poverty level, essentially. And so we're concerned about that nationally. We see that same pattern in California in terms of graduation rates being lower and also the post-school outcomes being poorer across the board. So what we're going to talk about briefly, Carolyn and I, is we also, since 1990, have been doing a lot of research on this, trying to understand transition services and transition outcomes. And there's a number of predictors that we know will improve those outcomes. They have been verified over time by numbers of different studies. And so the 4 predictors we'll talk about briefly are family involvement, work-based learning, inclusion, and interagency collaboration. So I'll start us off by talking a little bit about family involvement. We know this is critical for all kids in terms of meeting important education benchmarks, but it's especially critical for students with disabilities. We know that if families are involved in education, that students are more likely to complete high school, go on to some kind of employment or post-secondary education. Parents can be role models, they can be advocates, and they're lifelong investors in their young people. They want to see what's best for them. We also have some data that shows if parents have high expectations for their children with disabilities, that also predicts better outcomes. So if a parent believes that their student with Down syndrome is going to get a job, we see that that student is much more likely to be employed as an adult. So expectations as well as behavior and involvement both matter. So what can we do about parent involvement? We have a couple recommendations. We really think it's important to partner with families. Again, families have a wealth of knowledge about their own children that can be matched up with what schools know. That's more formal. Parents have the informal knowledge. They really need to work together in transition planning. Parents need information about resources and need information about options. Oftentimes when I talk to parents, they're frustrated because they just don't know what's next. They're in a school system and then there's a wealth of complicated options once you reach the post-school system. So there, we provide you with one resource there for parent training and information centers that we think is a good option to share. The next piece I want to mention in terms of an important predictor of increased outcomes is work-based learning or some type of employment. We know from studies over the last 20 years that if a young person with a disability has the opportunity to work while they're in high school, they are much more likely to be employed as an adult. And that could be through a range of different kinds of work experiences. We know that work teaches you about work, but it also teaches you about careers. And so young people can build skills and get more exposed to a broader range of careers, which then could potentially lead to higher wage employment options. There are also a number of different opportunities to gain work experience. It doesn't have to just be a paid job. Students can do job shadowing, they can do service learning, they can be involved at their school in some kind of a school-based business or other kinds of formal education. Last thing I want to mention about employment is just some recommendations. That picture, by the way, is a school-based business where the students are learning how to grow vegetables and then they harvest them and sell them at a local farmer's market. So they're getting experience in lots of different kinds of job skills through that school-based business. So we think it's important for high schools to encourage career exploration. We want students to have opportunities to try different kinds of careers. And finally, to be engaged in career and college readiness opportunities that are available for all young people. So I'm going to move over now to Carolyn, my co-author, who's going to talk about 2 other predictors of positive post-school outcomes.
Thank you, Lauren. So many of you know that inclusion of students with disabilities in general education settings is predictive of better outcomes for those students. And we know that one of those important numbers to think about is 80% or more of the school day, and that has been demonstrated to impact all sorts of different outcomes, from absences to better on-time graduation rates to higher rates of college attendance and employment. What we also know is that enrollment in career technical education courses is also predictive of post-secondary and employment and education for our students with disabilities. So that's another thing that us as educators can think about in terms of how we're planning to include our students with disabilities in the rich programming that's already available in many of our secondary schools. So kind of thinking about what we can do. So I already mentioned kind of making sure that we're maximizing opportunities that exist to all students in our schools and making sure they're inclusive for our students with disabilities. But I think a lot of us kind of struggle with what kind of professional learning and coaching may be required for our general education as well as our special educators to make sure that students with disabilities who are included in general education environments have a positive experience because they have the supports that they need in order to be successful. So I think some of the things we need to be thinking about as educators are how we are providing training and coaching in how to implement collaborative learning support models, whether that be co-teaching or something else to support our students with disabilities in general education environments. Universal design for learning is another key strategy and technique that teachers need to be using to help our students with disabilities be successful in those general education environments. And I believe that with all of us going into a new 3-year, the LCAP, the Local Control Accountability Plan, we're all in our districts developing these new plans. And I think we really have a unique opportunity to think about our students with disabilities as a student group to be supported through those LCAP plans, particularly around this professional learning and coaching, because many of these strategies that are going to support our students with disabilities in being meaningfully included in general education courses are also going to be supportive of all of our different diverse learners in our schools. Another thing that we know really matters in terms of being predictive of positive post-secondary outcomes is interagency collaboration. So we know that when local agencies, schools, the regional center, the employers, the Chamber of Commerce, other institutions of higher education, we know when those organizations get together and provide coordinated planning and formalized agreements to support students with disabilities and their families, we know that our students are going to have better outcomes. So we have some recommendations in this area as well. So we have been tasked in terms of our agencies to form these groups where we form these local partnership agreements. And all over the state, groups have been getting together to do this. And I think there's an opportunity to expand membership beyond the required partners, which would be school districts, the regional centers, and then our Department of Rehabilitations, to include some of those other partners in the community, such as members of the post-secondary education and employment opportunities for our students, to really make those plans even more meaningful for our students with disabilities and help them in that transition to post-secondary life. Another thing that's really will be helpful is creating community resource maps to assist families and youth. The post-secondary transition process is very complex and can be very confusing to families. So the more that we can do to create those maps and really support families with navigating that process. Along those lines, ensuring that we're partnering and inviting agencies who are supporting students outside of our school settings to their individualized education program, their IEP team meetings. So we need to do that with family and student permission, but it is really important to make sure our plans are coordinated to make sure we're providing the best possible support to our students with disabilities. So with that, Lauren and I are happy to answer any questions you have in the Q&A box. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn and Lauren. We're going to transition now over to Fred and Mary from San Diego State University, who will talk to us specifically about work-based learning opportunities for our students with disabilities.
We can't get it to advance.
Okay, I can advance for you, no problem.
Great, thanks,
Okay.
Jeannie.
Thanks.
Hi, everyone. So here at the Interwork Institute at San Diego State University, myself and Dr. Fred McFarland, our policy research focus was on work-based learning for students with disabilities. And the core value behind this, there you go. Thanks, Jeannie. The core value behind our policy research is the expectation that every students with and without disabilities can work, they can be productive. So in other words, all students can benefit from work-based learning experiences. And because we expect every student to be successfully employed, it's really important that work-based learning experiences are provided while they're in post-secondary education. And it's important for preparing them for adult life. It's important for learning. It's important for providing them with choices. And it's important for expanding life experiences. So what happens when we tell a student that employment is not a viable option for them? It's not a viable goal. And this we have heard countless times from families and students as well as from teachers. What happens is that employment does not become part of the planning process. And Action 1 really speaks to elevating our expectations for students with disabilities, no matter what their disability is, no matter the significance of their disability. For some, it's about having any expectation that a student with a disability can be successful in school and as adults. And it starts with asking, what are your dreams and interests, followed by what we as the professionals, as the teachers, as a support staff can do to make that happen. When we look at Action 2, what happens when we create programs that become their own silos? For example, one program, the focus is career assessment. The second program is on internships. The third program is on workplace support. The challenge is that students can't access each program. They can only access it one at a time. So the result is a disjointed and fragmented support system. Plus, not all students will benefit from any of these programs. So Action 2 is about leveraging opportunities so all students can benefit from the work-based learning experiences. It's about connecting all of these opportunities, supports, and services and removing the barriers to access and strengthening the partnerships, collaboration, and braiding of resources. When we look at Action 3, it's responding to the question of what happens when we allow systems to drive the way services are provided. We lose the connection to the original purpose of our programs, our goals, and the intent of the system, which is to be there for the students and their families and their needs and to address their dreams and support them in that. Action 3 is about services and supports being person-driven based on dreams, interests, and needs rather than system-driven based on categories, funding streams, etc. Now, the system-driven principles are important. They have a place, but it should not be the student and family having to jump through these hoops to access these services.
When we looked at those actions, we identified 7 policy recommendations that we had. The first one is introducing career and work to students at an earlier age. Our colleagues at Lodi, as an example, have started to look at the idea of talking about careers in a preschool level, but at least starting by middle school or younger makes a lot more sense than waiting to this magical age of 16. And so introducing careers and work and the whole principles around that at an earlier age in school and through home is a critical element. The second policy recommendation is requiring inclusion of students with a disability in local career development programs and holding LEAs accountable through those performance measures. The career and technical education document is being reviewed right now, and that one, as an example, talks about working with students with disabilities, but there are no performance measures attached nor dollars attached to it. The fourth area is incorporating student participation in community-based service learning and work experiences. Our colleagues right before us addressed a whole series of those areas, and we would totally support those recommendations that work is not just necessarily paid, but it can be a variety of experiences for the individual, all the way from site visits to employers, to talking about soft skills that are required, to being able to provide volunteer and community-based learning experiences, as well as the traditional ones of paid experience. Mary just talked about the idea of building in flexibility with regard to funding. And right now we seem to be siloed by funding categories or driving the experiences for the student rather than the student needs. If we looked at having funding attached to the student and those students' experiences, you'd open up a wealth of experiences for the individual and not try and fill categorical areas of funding. The last two that we identified is meeting students' needs through structured collaboration. This is mentioning the LPAs that exist, linkages with post-secondary ed, community partners, and especially employers. They're going to be looking at individuals for their workforce, not just today, but in the future, and showing how these students can be involved would be a part of that. Finally, applying the strong workforce program framework, metrics, and accountability with students with disabilities, and not just for general education students. We want all students to be looked at with disability being a factor, but of equal importance for all of the individuals. The whole idea of the integration of students. These skills are necessary both for general education as well as students identified with disabilities. And if we can go one, I think we have one more, yes. One of the students that we worked with said, "I am most proud of accomplishing what people said I couldn't do. Get a job," and I did it. We'd love to have all students say that. And I'll turn it back to you, Jeannie.
Thank you, Fred and Mary. And I guess I would like to thank all of our presenters, Nancy, Connie, Carolyn, Lauren, Fred, and Mary, for your research insights and presentations today. To honor your time, our authors have committed to reviewing the questions that you've included into the Q&A box, questions and comments, and we'll leave that open for a few minutes after the webinar in case you wanted to include a few more in there. And our authors will respond to them within the week. So in time for our next webinar, we will have posted some of their responses to your thoughtful questions, which we very much appreciate. So about the next webinars, we do have 13 research products that came out of this special education policy research panel, and you heard about a third of them today. We do have 2 more coming up, and we hope you'll register for those. The next one is about developing educator capacities to support the needs of students with disabilities. And then our third one is about developing systems to support schools to serve students with disabilities. And you can register for both of those on the PACE website. And so please keep an eye out for the webinar registration and also the responses to your questions based on the content in this webinar today. So I guess I will see you next time on March 5th. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you again to our panelists for sharing your research with us. We'll see you next time.